Welcome to the Workers' Party podcast with Joti Brar. Great. So welcome everybody to the first of our Workers' Party podcasts. Joining me today for a discussion about Afghanistan, I have Dave Kerr, who's a former Royal Marine, lives down in Dover. He left the service before the invasion of Afghanistan, but has some interesting insights for us, and he's one of our Workers' Party members in the South. We have Richard, who is currently living in China, but who's a former NCO in the British Army and served in Afghanistan in 2012. And we have Caleb. I think everybody knows Caleb Maupin, probably doesn't need an introduction, but just in case, he's an independent journalist, author and activist based in New York City and regularly appears on RT as well as many other places. But I think RT is probably where most of our people would have seen you the most, Caleb. And probably they've seen you quite a lot on Moats as well, George's show on Sputnik Radio. So just to introduce the topic, there's been a month now almost of crying in the British media about the terrible tragedy of NATO forces finally, after 20 years of war and occupation, pulling out of Afghanistan. But depending on where you're standing, that picture looks very different. The oppressed peoples around the world, the anti-imperialist forces around the world, have been celebrating mightily because it is a huge, huge defeat. And in fact, that so-called pullout turned into a really quite catastrophic and shambolic rout. And the similarities with Saigon in 1975 were so clear, you think they couldn't have designed it better to draw those parallels, right down to the actual photographs of the choppers on the embassy roof, evacuating the last of American personnel, official personnel, of course. So really, we've had all these crocodile tears shed over the plight of the Afghans, and that's what our politicians and our media constantly say to us. Oh, the Afghans who've been left behind to the mercy of the Taliban, they pretend that this is what they're really, really upset about. But we know from the 20 years of brutal occupation, the bombings of women and children incessantly in Afghanistan, and the destruction of the life and livelihoods, the infrastructure and the economy of Afghanistan, that it's not the Afghans that our rulers are really upset about. So, Caleb, I wondered if you could open us up with just talking a little bit about what are they really upset over?
Well, it appears that Afghanistan, now that the United States is no longer occupying it, may be moving into better relations with Russia and China. We've heard figures from the Taliban express interest in the Belt and Road Initiative, in economic development. And I think that is the real concern here. I will say that I wouldn't compare it to Saigon as much because I feel like this was a little bit of a handoff. There were negotiations going on, and it seems like at a certain date, there was a feeling that they were going to hand Afghanistan over to the Taliban. Now, obviously, the government that the United States and Britain backed fell a lot quicker than they anticipated. And we had Nicolas Maduro, the leader of Venezuela, coming forward and saying that he believed bad intelligence was given to Joe Biden intentionally. And that this is becoming a scandal in the United States. Joe Biden is being raked over the coals. They're saying the United States has been humiliated, and that, this is playing out to look as if the United States has completely embarrassed itself and such. One thing you have to say is that there seems to be all this concern for Afghan women and for the people. But where has U.S. media been for the last 20 years? I mean, for 20 years, the United States has been there and been, bombing and killing, and the poppy fields have been getting bigger for the narco gangs, and the terrorist groups have been getting stronger. For 20 years, life has been miserable there. And so it's not like the United States didn't have a chance. If the USA was really there to help the Afghans, it's not like they didn't have a chance to actually fulfill their goals. I mean, it's kind of weird hearing them sit there. It's almost like they're saying, if we just had one more day, things might get better. Well, you had 20 years. 20 years is a long time, and it's pretty clear the United States wasn't making things better in the country. We will have to see what comes next, because it's important to point out that the Taliban is a very, very diverse entity. There are some figures within the Taliban government who were in Guantanamo Bay and were, put back in government. There are some figures within the Taliban government who have a history with Voice of America and with U.S. state media. But on the other hand, there are people within the Taliban that seem very sympathetic to China and Russia. There are people within the Taliban who seem, to be making some pretty anti-imperialist statements. So we're going to have to see how the Taliban ultimately rules. But the United States, I think that their occupation of Afghanistan was intended to use Afghanistan as a strategic epicenter. They wanted the instability and chaos, the drug gangs, the terrorist groups to spread over the border into China, to spread over, north up into Russia, and to spread over the border into Iran. And we know that there were separatist groups that were trying to break Sunni regions of Iran away, that were, being backed by the United States, that would then go over the border into Iran. We know about the situation with the Uyghur separatists and the, pan-Turkism that China has been dealing with. We know about the global, opium and heroin epidemic, which, as a result of that. So, the United States was kind of using Afghanistan as a strategic epicenter of chaos. And now the United States has made a strategic decision to withdraw. And I think there are probably elements in the U.S. deep state that are hoping that maybe that this will cause Russia, China, and Iran problems, that they'll be spending so much of their resources trying to stabilize Afghanistan, that the United States will be able to escalate its interventions in places like Latin America. So we're just going to have to see what comes out of this. But there's a lot of potential now for peace, and there's a lot of potential for economic development. The road to a better Afghanistan is raising people out of poverty. It is jobs. It is economic opportunity. And the United States has not provided that in 20 years.
Absolutely. And I want to come back to some of those points in a little bit. But first, I'd really like to hear from our soldiers a little bit about, how they think, how they themselves as former soldiers and how the people they know are feeling about looking back at what's been happening. We had 20 years of overt war, and that followed 20 years of covert war. Right, that's 40 years of devastation and decimation wreaked on Afghanistan and its people. And, what was it for? So I just wonder, how do people who served in Afghanistan, how do former soldiers feel about the reality versus the narrative that was used to justify the invasion, justify the occupation, justify sending soldiers into that war? Richard?
Sure. Well, I've got a few things to say, I guess. Just on the first thing about the Saigon reference, at least even with Saigon, it took 2 years before before the regime actually collapsed. The troops pulled out in 73, and only 2 years later did they actually take over. Whereas the former Afghan government, those guys, but the US hadn't even left yet. The troops were still on the ground. So to use the term puppet regime almost seems like an insult to puppets. They fell so quickly, so rapidly. And I was listening to somebody the other day that Ashraf Ghani was apparently left with buckets of cash flown out of the north of the country into Tajikistan. It is an interesting, mixed feelings about the thing. Particularly, on the ground there were projects. You did have schools, you did have universities, and some infrastructure things going on. It's not like they didn't exist. But looking back and also looking at the reality now, it seems that at the top of this project, this 20-year project, so the fish rots from the head. And it seems like at the top of this setup was a very weak, corrupt, and frail thing, extremely weak. In that, like I said, before the troops were even gone, before the US had even left, they still had air cover, air support in some shapes and forms, and they had already fallen. In terms of also listening to Biden speak the other day, obviously a few days after the fall had happened, and he said, when would we have pulled out? When was a good time to pull out? And it actually, I think he was actually right, that after 20 years and so many troops and so much money, that there was never a good time for the US to pull out. The thing was probably doomed from the beginning, it seems. obviously what we were doing there, what we were told, and the sort of the name of the mission was nation building and these kinds of things. And sure, valiant effort, and yes, like I said, there were projects by NGOs and various things, but you can't hotwire a nation. I don't think someone else can build your nation for you. You can't take the wires and smash them together and hope that you build a nation like that. And if you think that's possible, I don't think the Afghan model or how they did it or how it was executed is the model of how you can do that, if you can do that, which I don't think you can. So yeah, I guess those are some of my feelings on the matter. Yeah.
Hey.
Yeah, obviously, like I said before, gladly, I never had to serve in Afghanistan. I left in 1994. I have, however, been in a lot of contact with former brothers, mainly in the maritime security role, where I work with a lot of young lads who had just left the Marines, had done several tours of Afghanistan. But the thing that came to head, it fell quicker than anticipated. And who anticipated? I'll tell you who's making that statement. It's people that have lied to us for years, that haven't got a clue. When I speak to guys that were actually out there, maybe Richard will back me up, when the combat operation stopped, and this is from a good source, this is from a guy who just left in February and was in Afghanistan last year and has done 7 tours of Afghanistan. When combat operations stopped, cut it short, he phones me every Monday, normally to rib me about my football team losing on the Saturday, but I decided to carry on the conversation and asked him, when you were in Afghanistan, what do you think about what was happening? He says, it came to no surprises me, Dave. He says, because when combat operations stopped, he says, our command and control were a little bit confused about the way the Afghan army were being used. He says, and quite simply, you could see the Taliban moving into the towns and cities. He says, so it was no surprise to us that when the announcement was made, they basically walk out the front door with an AK-47. They were already in Kabul. They were in Kabul weeks before any announcement was made, waiting for this announcement. Whether we're not party to this, are we? Negotiations had pre-warned them of dates, etc., before the media announcement. I mean, if this is the enemy, to give the enemy dates of withdrawal is probably one of the worst military tactics you could ever do. Yeah. Afghanistan was a mistake. But the one thing I really do have to say, having spent time talking to young lads, is I'm absolutely proud of the work our guys done on the ground. That's your grunts, your soldiers on the ground. I don't think they could have done any better. Maybe poorly led. They were sent to do a job. They've done the job to the best of their ability. Yeah. And there's a great number, obviously, didn't want to be there. You know, we're in the armed forces. We do a job. We follow orders. We do have thoughts. And it was my thoughts that made me leave in 1994. What was I then? That's 4 years short of a full pension. But to me, my morals said, no, time to go. So going, what they've said, now this is hearsay for me. I have no experience, like I've said before, I wasn't there. Hearsay to me was the strength of the Afghan army. There was no strength in the Afghan army. You had bravery beyond words from the Afghans. But when your command and control breaks down, there's nowhere else to go. Their command and control broke down several weeks before the pullout. Richard will probably tell us command and control was lacking severely in different areas way before any announcement. So, quicker than anticipated? Yes, Mr. Johnson, probably quicker than you anticipated, but the guys on the ground, the working class that are out there doing the job, they anticipated it. You got it wrong.
Yeah.
Thanks,
I'd
Dave.
just like to add
Yeah.
to what Dave was saying. Yeah, I mean, I was speaking to some other Australian veteran who I know here, and he served in 2003, and we were talking about, why did we get into the army? And for him and for all the lads that I served with, it's never a, I don't think I ever discussed politics with lads I was with. We were in basic training or basically any sort of normal interaction or normal conversation. We wouldn't talk about, let's go, we've got to go to Afghanistan and fight the Islamic insurgency and fight for the Western values of democracy, et cetera, et cetera. That's not something that soldiers necessarily talk about. I mean, it's not something that the lads I served with ever really talked about. It's a job, and usually, they come from poorer backgrounds, working class backgrounds, from deindustrialized cities and all this kind of stuff, places that don't necessarily have the best opportunities. So, just echoing what Dave was saying there, that the lads, they are just there to do their job. They get sent by the political masters, and that's the truth of that. There's no rabid, politically charged, common soldier that has a view that they're going to save the world or something like that. Most of the soldiers, almost every soldier that I ever met, was just a lad doing a job, and to the best of their ability, and sent to wherever the political masters choose. So that's true. In terms of the Afghan thing about command and control, I mean, obviously there's certain stories I can't really share the details, a bit too gruesome, whatnot. But there was a big problem even in 2012 with commanders. Whether it was just a lack of sort of being too much of an ego, so you'd have a commander that would demand to do a mission, and you'd have all of issues like that. But also just sheer corruption as well. We had vehicles that would be taken or wouldn't be delivered, and also we just had it was obvious that the numbers didn't make any sense. There would be soldiers that weren't there, the ghost soldiers they talk about. You'd have a camp next to ours where the ANA would be, and our camp would be here, and you'd go into their side, and it wasn't being run very well. You could tell there was things missing, and command was not great.
The paychecks, Richard.
What's that? The paychecks,
paychecks. When I said to him about they had an army of 350,000, he says, no, Dave, they have 350,000 paychecks.
Right, exactly. That's it. I mean, also, just there was lots of times you'd find the soldiers also didn't have any. I mean, well, it's a difficult one. Like Dave said, there were good soldiers. There were brave Afghan soldiers too. It's not a one size fits all story, but there was also lots of smoking marijuana, disillusioned soldiers too from their side. So it's not a simple sort of story with one narrative. There's lots of parts to it.
There's definitely a couple of threads that I notice in this, as the picture becomes clear, and as so often with imperialism, it's in its defeat, it's in its suffering. It's when it's fighting amongst itself, its leaders, that we start to see the details that before have been hidden from our view. Afghanistan is a story that the media has been anxious not to report on for a very, very long time. We've had very scant information and details. Little bits come here and there, odd little exposés or PR stunts or whatever, but the big picture doesn't come. Now when everybody's looking for who to blame, was it your fault? Was it your fault? That everyone's passing the buck. Then we see some of the details coming out, which are really instructive, actually. Just as with Iraq. I don't know if you guys remember, but when the occupation of Iraq began, a huge load of Iraqi money was stolen and used to fund the occupation and the nation building that they were pretending to engage in there. But it was cash. And they were sending soldiers and diplomats around the country with wads of cash to do who knows what with. There was no oversight. There was no reporting back of what had happened to this money. And so guess what? when they came to do their sums later on, when people started to recriminate a little bit, and there was a tiny bit of like what happened there, there was like, I can't remember now, some millions, many millions, hundreds of millions, a billion missing. I can't remember the number now, but I remember, the stories about it. And we're seeing the same in Afghanistan, that essentially with no oversight and with money just being thrown without the need for any kind of what do you call it? Accounting. All these ways of just pocketing money, have made themselves available to people who want to do that. And whether it's, the odd local warlord who's just on the make, yes, I can say that I've recruited, 50 soldiers and actually send them 5 and pocket the money. Or actually, it tends to be the people at the top. It's the Halliburtons and the directors of the arms companies, and they realize they're onto something. They can send a bill to the Pentagon for 30 helicopters and send a chitty to the Afghan army for 10 helicopters, and who knows who's checking the difference, So this route for money making, it's one of the reasons we say that corruption is at the very heart of capitalism. And everywhere you look in a capitalist or an imperialist venture, you see this rampant corruption. And it's just, for me, it's just one more example, of how that operates. And the absolute sort of moral vacuum when it comes to money making, that it has a logic of its own, doesn't it? That the motivation of money in a society brings with it all those behaviours, and you're not going to get rid of them. And all this kind of shock and outrage is it's useful education for the people, but who's actually shocked that all these people are on the make? What did we think they were there for? It'd been clear for a long time it wasn't to help Afghan women. The best situation for Afghan women was 42 years ago, which they moved heaven and earth and poured trillions in to destroy, because an independent Afghanistan, slap bang in the middle of Asia, bordering on all these, vital areas and countries of concern to the imperialists, cannot be allowed to exist. Independent, socialist leaning, Soviet friendly. Oh, no, to the imperialists. And that was that. And the amount of blood and treasure that's been spent, the soldiers I've talked to, and obviously I'm not a military person, but, they feel really disillusioned. And, they think about their comrades who've died, who've been wounded, and they realise they were sold a pack of lies. You're right, Richard, that they go, they're working class kids, they're not particularly politically engaged, they're just trying to do their job that they've been trained to do. They haven't thought too hard about it. They've trusted that the people who send them to war know what they're doing, but they do get given a story, don't they? What they're doing it for. We're doing it to help we're here to help the Afghans protect themselves and help Afghan women build they were building schools and universities back in the 70s. What happened to those? The women were, what happened? Of course, the young kids being sent in don't know that, but they're starting to find out now. What they can see now is 20 years after the invasion, the Taliban is back in control, and in better control than it was in 20 years ago. But it kind of leads me on a little bit to another question I had, really for Caleb, I guess, about the Taliban, because we know that the original, Taliban 1.0 was founded by the imperialists as a force to be used against the Soviet-friendly government, as a destabilizing force, and they threw money and weapons and training and propaganda support at that movement, hand over fist, in order to destabilize both Afghanistan and the Soviet Union by proxy, but really to destroy that government, that independent government that was in Afghanistan. And in so doing, they also destroyed Afghanistan, But now the Taliban, having come to power with the blessing of the US, the Taliban back in 1996, its government was making good friendship overtures to the government of George W. Bush. Well, that wasn't 96, was it, whenever he came in? You know, making oil deals or talking about the pipeline deals they were going to do. And that's something that, you know, I remember writing about this at the time of the invasion of Afghanistan, you know, that actually that pipeline deal had gone sour because the Taliban got a little bit of independent mindedness. They decided that they were going to cut poppy production in Afghanistan, which they actually did, and which hugely messed up the global heroin trade, which the US uses in all sorts of ways. And they wanted a bigger royalty on the proposed pipeline. I mean, you'd think it's a small thing, right, for a country to say, well, you know, if the pipeline's going to go through, we should have a royalty that's a bit meaningful. But these two things combined, as far as I could see, really put the imperialists out of love with the Taliban. Really put them out of love. They thought they were becoming a bit independent, and they didn't like the look of it. They'd put them in power to be a puppet regime, and they started to think for themselves. But what's interesting to me is, after 20 years of being the figurehead of the resistance and being synonymous with Afghan resistance, what I'm interested to know is, do people feel that we're looking at the same Taliban we were looking at before? Because it seemed to me that Taliban has become not so much a, you know, single-minded Islamist movement as it was originally envisaged, as a kind of a brand name for a national resistance movement, which is quite a different thing. And Afghanistan has, from what I understand, quite a history of, it has a culture and a history of pragmatism when it comes to joining forces against outsiders in particular. So I wondered, Caleb, if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, there's a lot that could be said there. When you talk about the corruption that went on, one of the most wild stories we saw in American media was that it was revealed about a year ago that a number of American companies were just handing out cash to the Taliban. They would build a building and they didn't want it to get blown up. So they would then go meet with the local Taliban and give them thousands of dollars not to blow up their building. And, you know, this is who we're supposed to be fighting against. You're giving money to the enemy, but this was just standard practice for all these Pentagon contractors. You know, if you read some of the documents that you know, we are sure they have internal conversations that we, the public, are not privy to. But the writings of William S. Lind have been published when he comes up with this concept of fourth generation warfare. And they talk about how, you know, counterinsurgency tactics have been kind of reinvented since the Vietnam War, and how the handing out of cash is a method, and how the cultivation of different proxy forces, it's more effective to cultivate a domestic proxy army to fight local forces. And it was revealed, the New York Times has revealed, that there have been a number of CIA operatives who have died in Afghanistan who were embedded with various local Islamic fighting groups. And we don't know which groups they were particularly embedded with. The Port Authority Police of New York and New Jersey were embedded with Jundullah, which was a separatist group that was trying to break the Sunni regions of Iran away from Iran. And so much so that they knew about terrorist that were intended to take place in Iran. And they told, you know, the Port Authority Police told US officials about this, and US officials didn't give that information to Iran, and all kinds of civilians were blown up when the Jundullah terrorists were operating there. So there are details about this that have come out. I mean, apparently a number of these Islamic terrorist groups in Afghanistan are being, you know, have been armed and supported by the United States. Furthermore, the United States was giving money to the Taliban to not blow things up. There's a lot of details there that are going to come out eventually, that we'll find out about how completely disorganized this occupation really was. And even with their you know, reinvention of counterinsurgency warfare, they weren't able to really stabilize Afghanistan. When you talk about the history of Afghanistan, I mean, you know, after the Bolsheviks took power in the Soviet Union, one of the first things they did was they convened the Conference of the Peoples of the East. And they met with people throughout Eurasia. And one of the people they met with was the infamous Emir of Afghanistan. And the Emir of Afghanistan was not a liberal by any means. He was not a progressive by any means. But, Vladimir Lenin made clear, he said, we would support anyone against the imperialists, including the Emir of Afghanistan. And Lenin and the Emir of Afghanistan had a good relationship. And the Bolsheviks offered military support to the Emir of Afghanistan in his fight against the British Empire. That kind of showed the commitment to anti-imperialism, and how the Bolshevik understanding was that capitalism in our time is imperialism. It is the domination of the world by big banks and corporations based in the Western countries that are holding back economic development around the world, and that it was in the interests of the Bolsheviks and the working people of the entire world to resist imperialism, and to align with any force that would resist imperialism, no matter what its ideology or perspective. And I think that's one particularly interesting anecdote from Afghan history. I think Stalin, in his book The Foundations of Leninism, he also references the Emir of Afghanistan and the Soviet Union's support for the Emir of Afghanistan in its fight against the British. The other thing that I think is interesting is, when you talk about in the 1970s and 80s in Afghanistan, what was going on there, we now have, it's a matter of public records. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the longtime U.S. strategist, came out and he said it was the Afghan Trap. The United States provoked a situation in Afghanistan where you had a monarchy in Afghanistan that was neutral, that there was a very pro-Soviet political party, the People's Democratic Party, but there were also pro-U.S. forces, and you had a monarchy that was friendly to both the United States and the Soviet Union. And you had the situation where Brzezinski admits what happened was the United States pressured the Afghan monarchy to begin a huge crackdown on the pro-Soviet People's Democratic Party, which had a lot of support in the military, and basically forced them into a situation where they had to take power. They didn't have the support among the rural population that they would have needed to have a stable, coming to power, but they did have support in the cities and among the military. And so when the United States, kind of forced the monarchy to start cracking down on this major political party that had support in the military, they basically had to have a coup and take power in order to not be killed. And so you had a situation where the People's Democratic Party in 1978 took power prematurely. And then almost as soon as they took power, the United States was ready to go with Osama bin Laden, with, al-Zarqawi and others who just poured into the country and fomented this insurgency. And that then, of course, the Soviet Union didn't want to have a base of anti-Soviet Islamic fighting on its border. Right there in Afghanistan. So the Soviet Union was then obligated to support their aligned political party, the People's Democratic Party, to intervene. We get these crazy narratives where people say the Soviet Union, quote unquote, invaded Afghanistan. Well, no, they were invited by the government, and they invaded it because they wanted hot water. They wanted water, drinking water or something from the ocean. It's this elaborate story. And it's very clear why the Soviet Union intervened. They intervened because their aligned political party was forced to come to power in order to not be wiped out. And then as soon as it came to power, it faced an extremist terrorist campaign, at which point that terrorist campaign was not simply for Afghanistan. You already had a Chechen anti-Soviet insurgency that was backed by the United States and Saudi Arabia. And the plan of Brzezinski was to spread an Islamic insurgency all throughout the southern Soviet Union and to turn Afghanistan into a base to spread terrorism all throughout Central Asia. And so the Soviet Union obviously felt an obligation to intervene and support their allies. And then when they did, according to Brzezinski, the plan was to hand the Soviet Union, give the Soviet Union their own Vietnam, and to demoralize them. And it's they make it sound like nobody in Afghanistan supported the People's Democratic Republic. Well, the Soviet Union withdrew its forces in 1989. So they withdrew all their forces, but the People's Democratic Republic of Afghanistan held out until 1993 without any Soviet support. They were not getting any Soviet support, but they held out that long against forces that were backed by the United States and Saudi Arabia. And so the idea that they didn't have any support is completely outrageous. Now, what's interesting is that the Taliban is a little bit, there was the insurgency that was, there was Osama bin Laden and other forces. The Taliban is actually, there was a divide in the insurgency. There was one section that was, fully in with Saudi Arabia, but the Taliban were a little more of a domestic wing of that insurgency. Their interpretation of Islam was a little more Afghan specific. They weren't as loyal to Saudi Arabia, and there was a fight between the U.S. backed forces after the People's Democratic Party was defeated, and the Taliban was the little more domestic version of it. And one thing that the Taliban did was they started burning down the poppy fields and arresting the heroin dealers, so much so the UN, the United Nations, gave them awards for what they did and praised them for their efforts to stop the heroin trade. That's when I do recall, I was a child, I wasn't paying huge amounts of attention to politics at the time, but I do recall it was like suddenly, it was before 9/11, suddenly we were starting to hear the Taliban were no good in US media. They destroyed some ancient Buddhist statues. And I mean, as if there aren't regimes all over the world that engage in religious suppression. But suddenly I remember even as a kid, it was all over media. Oh, this government in Afghanistan has blown up these statues. They're awful. And and all of a sudden it was part of being a good, socially aware, socially conscious American was you had to hate the Taliban because they were no good because they blew up some statues. And what's particularly interesting is if you look at that time period, right, in the lead up to 9/11, what was going on was that there was starting to be a blowback around the world against neoliberalism. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States, the sole superpower, they were imposing free market neoliberalism in Latin America and Eastern Europe, and the world was just suffering. I mean, there was mass death, and people were losing their jobs, and a rise in the heroin trade, and a rise in sex trafficking across Eastern Europe, and poverty everywhere. And the United States was just imposing neoliberalism everywhere. And then you had in Venezuela, you had the election of Hugo Chavez, which was a turning point against neoliberalism. And in Russia, you had the victory of Vladimir Putin, which was a turning point against neoliberalism. He was seen as somebody who was not Boris Yeltsin, who was not going to cooperate with the United States. And in South Korea, you had the Sunshine Policy, where suddenly you had leadership in South Korea that didn't want to fight with North Korea, that wanted to negotiate with North Korea. And you started to see the beginning of global resistance to neoliberalism, specifically centered in Russia and in Asia. And that's when following 9/11, and especially following the oil pipeline that didn't go through, that's when the United States made this decision. They had to intervene in Afghanistan. And we were told, well, that's because Afghanistan and the Taliban was supporting Osama bin Laden. We now learn that the details of that are not even really accurate, right? We learned that the Taliban was willing to hand over bin Laden. They just wanted to put him through their extradition process or something like that. And that wasn't enough. And we were, they were harboring him. And after all this, we learned that, the United States killed Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. He was not in Afghanistan. So the whole conflict, we've been told a pack of lies, and it seems like, again, it gets back to Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the mastermind behind the U.S. intervention there to overthrow the People's Democratic Party. He wrote a book in the 1990s about the U.S. strategy to control the Eurasia. And basically what he referred to is he said that the strategy is to, quote, keep the barbarians killing each other. That's what he said. Those are his words. And that Eurasia, the Nazis were desperate. That's why they invaded the Soviet Union. They were desperate to control the Eurasian landmass. That if you can dominate, that big area of land that is Russia and China, that is Central Asia, you can dominate that, you can dominate the whole world. And the US imperialists know that. And historically, and we're talking for thousands of years of geopolitics, those regions have been strongest when they're unified, right? The reason that Ivan the Terrible is loved, the reason they made a movie about him during the Second World War is he unified all of the areas of Russia. And when they were unified, they could then begin economic development. The reason the Qing dynasty is so widely loved in China is, again, because they unified all of China, right? And so the strategy of the imperialists for dominating Eurasia has long been to break it into pieces, play all the ethnic groups against each other, break it into different factions, and as Brzezinski put it, keep the barbarians killing each other. And it seemed like Eurasia was starting, we saw the very beginning of kind of the blowback of neoliberalism after the fall of the Soviet Union. There was starting to be some talk of maybe some kind of new Silk Road or the Belt and Road out of China. Putin was coming into office in Russia, and that's when the United States felt it necessary to get in there and stop that as quickly as they could. And that seems to be what they spent the last 20 years doing, is trying to prevent economic development in Central Asia.
And how beautifully it has backfired, Caleb, when we look now at the most likely scenario seems to be precisely that Afghanistan is going to be absorbed into the Belt and Road Initiative, into the China-Pakistan corridor, that will be the way that it can become secure and get some development, and that will only strengthen the anti-imperialist forces and raise up the life of the people whilst really stumping the plans of imperialism. And it's a wonderful outcome to a 20-year imperialist endeavour, I have to say. And it was interesting to me to see the session in the British Parliament when they all came rushing back from their holiday to deal with the emergency that they were in fact utterly powerless to do anything about. They had no say in anything. They'd had no say in the invasion, in the occupation, in the running of the operation, in the way that the evacuation happened, in none of it. And what I thought when I was looking at these guys all shouting and blaming each other and crying their hearts out over the soldiers or the women or whoever it was they decided to pin their tears onto, that it was a real case of consciousness lagging behind reality. It's like the British establishment and the British ruling class that finally got the message that Britain is not as powerful as it likes to think it is. You know, they've sort of known for a long time that they have to hitch their wagon to one or another big imperial project. And the big split in the British ruling class since the Second World War has been, which imperial project do we hitch our cart to? Are we a big fish in the European pond in that imperial project? Or are we a junior partner to the American imperial project? And really, the divide depends on what kind of capital you represent. If you're a banker, if you're into oil and armaments, you think a good idea is to hitch yourself to the American war chariot. If you're making almost anything else with your money, you tend to side with the European side. But you can see which side's been stronger by the policies of the British ruling class over the last 20 years. You know, we are dominated by the banks, the oil, the financiers, the arms manufacturers to a great extent. And that was absolutely personified by Tony Blair, but it's not only by him. But it was really fascinating to see them sort of waking up and beating their chests over their helplessness, in fact, in the face of this massive defeat. And it brought to mind for me the words of an Iranian professor, Mohammad Morandi. He was on George's show a few weeks ago, and he summed it up really beautifully. He said, "The world has changed. The world has changed. In the last 20 years, while America's been fighting these wars and exporting violence all over the globe, everybody else wasn't just sitting still and waiting to be the next victim. People have understood lessons of what imperialism is in a way that no amount of lectures on Lenin could have done from their practical experience. All over the Middle East, resistance movements have been developing and growing. Iran is not only rising itself, but is connected to the resistance movements all across the Middle East, which are growing stronger by the day, you know, and totally outgunning now between them Israel, which was supposed to dominate the region on behalf of imperialism. And then we see Russia and we see China. And who is it who is engaging with the new Afghan government? Who is it who's offering emergency aid and relief to the Afghan people rather than sanctions to starve them? Who is it who's offering them economic development that's meaningful? Meaningful trade, meaningful development, meaningful infrastructure. You know, you can see video of the highway that the Chinese have built into Pakistan, and imagine what they'll do for Afghanistan. You know, these are real, tangible benefits which will change people's lives significantly. And to me, it's a really wonderful thing to see. And those words of Professor Morandi's, "The world has changed," really rang very true for me. And I just want to open it up to you guys, you know, on that note, the world has changed.
Well, yeah, Joti, what we have to look at, I'm looking from a direction of a lot of guys behind me called Royal Marines. A lot of them lost their lives. A lot of them were seriously injured. And the vibes I'm getting from them is it wasn't a waste of time if. It's a big if. And Richard will back me up. When you go into an operation in any of the branches of the armed forces, yes, you have a job to do, but you always try and do that little bit extra for the local population. It's called hearts and minds. Sometimes not always possible if they don't want you to. Now, what I would personally hope for was the Taliban has changed. The Taliban become stable. I mean, unity is strength. We know unity is strength. They must get the Afghan tribes together. The only way to do that is a project from China that benefits the whole country. Now, I think what you would want as a serviceman, if you went in there, like I say, I was never there, is your little bit help. Education continues. Infrastructure investment comes in. But the big thing for me is like you said earlier, Joti, is let's get away from America. Let's become an independent nation with the best armed forces in the world where we can go to help. And I mean, really mean to help. Humanitarian aid. We have the men, we have the equipment. We've got aircraft carriers that produce an enormous amount of water. This is what we should be doing. We should be looking to be a nation where people say the armed forces, they're absolutely brilliant. They come, they build, they help. Everybody, I think now everybody is a battle medic. Everybody has these medical skills. Let's get away from America. Let's get away. We don't want to be part of the European army. Let's stay independent and use our armed forces to the best of their ability.
Thanks, Dave. And of course, we've got a wonderful example of what that looks like in Cuba, don't we?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Cuba endlessly sends doctors and all kinds of experts to help people in all kinds of emergency situations. They've helped medics all around the world for COVID, although they've had a difficult time themselves. They send people to help with earthquakes, with tornadoes, you name it. There's a Cuban brigade turning up to help people. And you're right, that is a way to hearts and minds all over the world when your help is offered with no strings attached, human to human. And that's what humanitarian aid should be. We have this label humanitarian aid that's put on all kinds of black operations run by the imperialists carrying out their own pursuit of profit operations. And they put these labels, humanitarian aid, on the front of it. And it gives the whole concept a nasty taste in the mouth and a very bad name with the people of the world. They've had enough of the imperialists' humanitarianism. But real humanitarianism, people to people, nation to nation, expertise given freely and willingly to help other human beings, that's something that will always be appreciated. And that's the kind of country I think we can all aspire to, definitely.
Yeah, no strings attached, Joti.
No strings.
And the only thing you get is a handshake. That's all we want. There we go. We've done it. See you later. Bye-bye. Go in there and help. Shake the hand. How's that? That's great. Thanks for your help. Cheerio. Bye-bye.
Well, I'd like to touch on, the human cost of this war because, we're on here talking about history and facts and details. But I just want to talk about some of my own direct experience. I'm from a small town in Ohio. I graduated from a high school class of about 115. And a number of students that I went to school with went to Afghanistan and fought in Afghanistan. And I will never forget the day. It was 5 or 6 years ago. My phone rang and someone called me and they said, you need to get on Facebook right now and look at what this woman who I went to school with was saying. She was on Facebook and she was in Afghanistan. She was one of the occupying US forces and she was on there just letting everything come out. I don't want to be here. The people here don't want us to be here. This is an awful place. I'm miserable, and she was not holding back on social media. I don't know what the rules are about military folks talking on social media. I don't know if she got in any trouble, but people were showing me these posts of this person I went to school with just saying, why are we here? They don't want us here. I don't want to be here. This is awful. This is horrible. And it was almost kind of comical in a way. But there's been another, I mean, there's, you know, the thing about Afghanistan, you talk about, the heroin epidemic that has devastated in the last, few years, that has devastated so many communities throughout the United States. I mean, it's massive, and it has a lot to do with what happened in Afghanistan. I mean, opioid deaths in the United States, especially since the pandemic, have just skyrocketed. I mean, working class people whose lives have been destroyed, and it has a lot to do with facing the stress of being low income and not being able to pay your bills and worried about feeding your kids and worried about, if your home is going to get foreclosed if you don't make this payment. And amid that stress, a lot of people have succumbed to this opioid epidemic. We find out that Big Pharma was also, overprescribing, opioids. They were pushing doctors to overprescribe opioid medications. And this all kind of culminated in a crisis that every day, I mean, there's a body count in the United States, and it's related to Afghanistan, and it's related to the whole global system of imperialism, the decline of living standards, the greed of big pharma corporations, as well as the imperialist project in Afghanistan. Another thing that I want to add is, there's some friend of mine who his job is he trains truckers. He does a trucking school. He trains people to be truckers. And a lot of the people he trains are former soldiers who were driving trucks in Afghanistan. One of the saddest stories I heard was that, right after the shootings in Paris, after the ISIS terrorist attacks, one of these truckers he'd been working with, a guy who'd served in Afghanistan, he heard about that and he refused to leave his home. He had PTSD, because you can imagine the experience of driving down the highways of Afghanistan with the fear at any point you might get blown up, you might get shot, maybe seeing or witnessing another truck or another car get blown up and all of this. And so, he was, just trying to get his license to be a trucker back in the United States that's not in the middle of a civil war. And, he immediately heard, about the shootings, and he suddenly, this man wouldn't leave his home. Out of fear. I mean, and that kind of shows the human cost of this occupation. I mean, so many people have been affected by this. I mean, we talk about, the number of dead, right? It's in the thousands, but that doesn't include the number of people who've lost arms or lost legs, or the number of people who are just traumatized with PTSD. This has been so bad for the United States. And there's a lot of debate now online about, can one call themselves a socialist? And can one, call themselves an anti-imperialist and be patriotic and be, a patriotic citizen? And I would argue that you can, and that these wars are the most unpatriotic things. They're bad for America. You go throughout America's working class communities. There's many people who love their country, who love their community and are angry to see, their kids sent off to die in these wars, are angry to see the economic devastation that has been brought by this global financial system of free market capitalism. I think opposing this war and calling out the big banks and corporations and military contractors that have benefited from it is probably the highest expression of patriotism. And deep down, millions of Americans know that the leaders of this country are not loyal to them, are not trying to make their life better. And Donald Trump got elected on a platform of saying he was going to stop meddling around the world, that he was going to stop intervening. And it's really the right in the United States that have kind of become the voice of non-interventionism, because the left has just focused on identity politics and has focused on kind of, attacking populism and waging a culture war against religious folks and such. And because of that, we have this very odd situation where there's a lot of working class people who, are angry and sick and tired of these wars, and they're rallying around the right wing. So it's a very confusing situation politically, as we're seeing, the continual decline of Western capitalism. Things are getting very confusing, but ultimately, I think millions of working class people have very anti-imperialist views. I mean, you talk to average Americans from red states, from small towns like the one I grew up in, they're against these wars. It's the liberals. It's those college-educated middle-class liberals who say, "Oh, well, the women, we have to be there," and the Soviet Union killed so many Afghans, and the blah blah blah, and Iran, and it's the educated elite that are the ones that that favor intervention. It's very odd. It used to be during the Cold War, it was, most of the US population was inculcated with this pro-imperialist anti-communism, and the universities kind of served as kind of the the place where people learned that there's two sides to the story, and that not everything is completely black and white. Now it's completely flipped. Now average working class Americans, maybe they don't know a lot about Afghan history, but they don't want us there. They say, America first, let's focus on making a better country here and stop bombing and destroying other countries. And people go to college and they get into academia to learn why it is you have to be an imperialist, and why we're spreading these sophisticated liberal values all over the world. Things are very strange politically. This is definitely a new ballpark, as we would say over here, right? It's a new ballpark because politics and the political landscape is really shifting, and that's why I look with such inspiration to what you all are doing with the Workers' Party. And I think what you guys are doing is the future. This is the future of socialism, right? Is what you guys are doing with the Workers' Party, because you're breaking out of this false, confused left-right paradigm where working people are feeling increasingly alienated from what calls itself left. And here in the United States, I tell people more and more to just pay attention to what Joti Brar, what George Galloway, what others are doing with the Workers' Party, because this is the future of socialism. And in the United States, if we want working class people to begin fighting for their own interests, they need to start talking less like college professors and social justice warriors on the internet, and more like you guys.
That's beautiful. Thanks, Caleb. And it's a perfect moment to wrap up, really, because it does bring us back to what we're all doing here. We founded the Workers' Party precisely because there is no interest for working class people in the perpetuation of these wars. They strengthen our class enemies. They do nothing for us except take our lives, take our resources. Terrible crimes are committed in our names, and we are expected to bear the brunt and pay the price of those crimes. That's why the Workers' Party's programme has as its number one point an end to imperialist wars and financial domination, starting with withdrawal from NATO. And we're absolutely unequivocal about that. We would never budge from that position. We are anti-imperialist to our core. We are on the side of all those who fight against imperialism, because we understand that imperialism is our enemy, as well as the enemy of the peoples all over the world who are plundered by imperialism. And you're right, Caleb. British workers all over the imperialist world, we need to start fighting back. We need to start to unite on a class basis to fight in our own interests and to recognise who else is on our side. We do not, in the Workers' Party, we love our country because we're from here. We are from here, and all of our friends are from here, and our relations are from here, and this is who we are. We are British. And we will not be ashamed of being British, but nor will we identify ourselves with our ruling class. They are not on our side. Our culture is not their culture. Our interests are not their interests. We have our own Britain that we are fighting for, the Britain of the workers, of the working people. And we hope it will be a proud Britain, and a Britain that has a lot to contribute to the world with its expertise and its creativity and all those other things which are systematically stifled right now. But we have a lot to offer the world as people, human to human, as Dave was saying. And we look forward to being in a position when we can really do that and play a useful role in the world, instead of being constantly ashamed of the role our country plays in the world and embarrassed by it. We are not embarrassed to be British, that's for sure. And so I would wrap up just by asking people, this is the first one of these we've done, so leave a comment if you like it or you don't like it. Let us know if you want more of this. Check out, if you haven't already, check out the Workers' Party website, look at our About page, you'll see our 10-point programme there. We want to be as broad as possible an organisation of the working class. We don't demand unity on every single question. You don't have to agree with everything George says. You don't have to agree with everything I say. You just have to accept our 10-point programme as the unifying force that helps us to unite, to organise, to grow. The working class people desperately need a voice, and we want to be that voice. So thank you very much once again to our guests for joining us today. Thank you to you for listening, and I hope to see you again soon.